I'm sorry?
No, that was just a recording. I hit the button.
Okay. So, I'm a relative newbie to the Vista community, having, been a member of the community only since 2001, and I'm also a relative newbie in the mumps community, having been here only since 1995. And I'm always amazed at, how long, at these meetings I keep running into people who've been there long before me. So it's a humbling experience. But in any case, let me just sort of give you the bottom line here. If you're using GTM, YottaDB is GTM for all practical purposes. It's the same code base. It'll run exactly like GTM. But I'll also tell you a little bit about why I'm no longer with GTM and also what we intend to do with YottaDB. So I just went to my second slide. I want to make sure that the technology is working and that everyone now has a slide called agenda.
Yes.
Okay. So basically, I'm just going to say, give you a little bit of news, talk about our plans, and then, there's time for discussion. And also, by the way, this is mostly going to be, I've left a lot of time for Q&A. I mean, I really don't have a whole lot to say, but I'm happy to answer any questions or respond to any comments that people have. And also, since the topic was also relevant to the 35th Vista Community meeting a couple weeks ago at Fairfax, Virginia, at George Mason University, these slides are exactly the same from those. So the first thing is the news. So YottaDB LLC is a real company. We have an office. We have a website. And no, before you ask, those are not my kids. Those just happen to be some rather cute kids from one of the predefined themes at the web hosting provider that we're hosting with. And, we still need to define our own branding and so on. So as an interim measure, I just chose this theme. And so we have offices, we have telephone, and so we have a website. And actually, don't get me started on what it takes to actually start a company, because we're still not fully done yet. And one of the longest things is actually getting that landline installed and working. So we have that's a photograph of the world headquarters of YottaDB LLC, and I'm currently talking from the desk at the right, and at the other desk is Narayanan Iyer, who's our chief architect, and we also have Steve Estes, who's a telecommuter. So the three of us have worked together for over 20 years on as part of the GTM team, and we're currently looking to add talent. And given how hard it is to find the right skill set for doing development of the kind that we need to develop, and literally, back in my GTM days, we were routinely competing with people like Google and Facebook and some other startup you never heard of in Silicon Valley. That the strategy that I'm trying to employ right now is work with universities that have co-op and intern programs as part of their academic curricula, and then to bring them in, have them work with us, and then when they graduate, hopefully they'll know us and we'll know them, and that'll be a good long-term source of talent for us, and for the people in the programs, it'll be a potential employer. So we are, of course, we're flexible, and if the right person with the right skill set happens to come along, we're happy to, discuss working with that person. But this is our office. We're about 950 square feet, and at the far corner, you can see our conference room and our spacious offices. So the first thing we really had to do was set up our development processes and show that we could actually develop software. So YottaDB is basically built on GTM, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. It's built on GTM, but along with the source code. So what FIS released with every GTM release was the source code, and they gave instructions on how to build GTM from that source code to build the binaries. But behind it is an entire sort of machinery of automated tests and build scripts, and literally there's like somewhere between 2 and 3 dozen servers which do different kinds of testing and so on to bring you the code. So there's actually a lot that goes on behind the scenes, and much of that is actually tied to the FIS infrastructure itself. You know, things like server names and network configurations and all kinds of stuff that doesn't make sense for them to release. So we actually spent a long time putting together our infrastructure and making sure that we could actually build software and test software so that we could have the same confidence in YottaDB releases that we had in GTM releases when we put out GTM releases. And, you know, we proved that by basically putting out YottaDB R 1.00. So our release nomenclature, just so that there's less confusion. So GTM calls them versions as in $Z version, and that's sort of a mumpsism. And so we decided that we would call our software releases, and the first one will be R 1.00 rather than, you know, GTM use the V nomenclature. And one of the things that we're going to do, since each YottaDB release is built on a GTM release, the $Z version will be unchanged from the underlying GTM source code, and there will be a $ZY release, which will be the YottaDB release name. And so that way, if you have code that checks for $Z version and checks to see that it contains GTM, that code will continue to work unchanged. So in fact, one of the things that you will see as we go forward is that we really intend to make YottaDB a complete drop-in replacement for GTM. So if you're using GTM, moving to YottaDB will be seamless. So we had our first release, and this actually took quite some time, a couple of months or more, to actually create all of the infrastructure needed. And we're not completely there yet, but you know, we're mostly there. And hopefully sometime in the late summer to early fall, we'll put out the next release and the next release and so on. So this took some time.
So just to make sure that, as far as, you know, every time GTM makes a release, you will have a corresponding version of YottaDB.
Yes.
Of that. But I'm sure you also will be including features that's specific to YottaDB.
Right.
That will be added, right?
Yep.
On top of it. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
And in fact, I can't speak for FIS, but I sincerely hope that they find it worthwhile taking our changes and putting them back into GTM, because one of the things that we're doing is, you know, we're finding and fixing bugs just as we did when we were part of the GTM group, but we're also making enhancements. And since, you know, we all have such a long history of working with the code base, we're making our enhancements in such a way that we're not, you know, defeating anything that FIS has done with the code base and so on. We're trying to make our changes in such a way that they can be retrofitted to the GTM code base.
Mm-hmm.
And we have customers, so not that we have a lot of customers, but you know, we actually started out with one customer. So at the moment, we actually have a going business and a going concern. And of course, we're a startup, so you know, we have the usual challenges of a startup, but we literally are up and running as a business. So as I said, we've got an office, we've released software, we have customers, we have processes, and we have a bank account and all the other stuff that goes with it. We have an accountant, we have someone that does payroll, and we have to pay taxes, and you wouldn't believe the amount of paperwork we have to go through to start a company, but that's another story. Ask me about that over a beer and I'll keep you busy. You know, whoever said that it's easy starting a company has never actually done it. Okay, so what are our plans? So the first and most important thing is that we're going to continue the the tradition. So whatever you expected of GTM, you should expect of YottaDB and more. So we're going to use the rock solid, lightning fast, secure, pick any three tagline. And it's one of those things where it was the tagline for my email when I was sending emails out from FIS, but FIS never really adopted it, and it kind of didn't fit with their overall marketing message, so we're going to use that as our tagline. And it is the same code base, and it's tested just as well. So you should have whatever confidence you had in GTM, you should have that in YottaDB and more. And we are going to go the extra mile to make sure that each YottaDB release is compatible with the GTM release that it's built on. So every time there is a GTM release, we'll take that code, we'll retrofit our changes on top of that, and of course we'll make our own additional enhancements and whatnot for our next release. And then we'll put out a YottaDB release. And just as you've come to expect that each GTM release will be upward compatible with its predecessor, we'll also have each YottaDB release will be compatible not just with the GTM release that it's built on, but also will be compatible with the prior YottaDB release. And as I said, we have the expertise to make this happen. I mean, literally, I've got a couple of the most senior people from the GTM team working with me, and we've worked together for a very long time. Now, that's not to say that that this can continue forever. So basically, at some point, right now FIS has to take our changes and put them back in, and if they opt to do that, as I hope they will, then I think that the inevitable day that a fork might happen, that inevitable day may never come, because again, we'll go the extra mile to communicate with them and to try to make sure that that we stay compatible. But ultimately, I can't speak for them. And should FIS opt not to take our changes and put them back in the code, at some point in the future, a fork is going to be inevitable. And hopefully we'll try and make that not happen in the near future. But when that happens, we will make sure that we remain compatible with that last GTM baseline. And in fact, if there are other changes beyond that they make that are attractive, we will take those changes and incorporate them in YottaDB. So our goal is actually not to take anything away, but to add to it, and we want YottaDB to be the best platform for Vista and all other MUMPS applications. So that's the position that we're taking. And the other thing that we're doing is we want to run this as a real free and open source software project. So yes, GTM is released under a free and open source software license, but the way it worked was that every release of GTM, there was a corresponding drop of the source code. And so it wasn't really a fully open source project in that sense. So if there's a developer working on the outside, that developer wouldn't necessarily be able to stay compatible with the code they're doing, with their code changes. And we, on the other hand, intend to run YottaDB as a complete open source project. We're actually using GitHub for our own software integration. So when our developers make enhancements and and we do the code reviews and we stage the code, that code is actually visible. So you can see the code that we're working on for the next release as we're making the release, and that means that you'll be able to see whether any changes that you've made are compatible with what we're doing. And so the long-term goal, I mean, the fact is that we're small. There's only so many things that we can do, and there are only so many hours in the day. So I think the way that we can hope to be successful is by by making this a true open source project, we can essentially create resources like coding standards, and we can help people with code reviews and help people with coaching and mentoring and so on, so that there is a small core of us who actually work for YottaDB LLC, and ultimately we're responsible for the releases. But if someone has an itch they want to scratch and something they want to contribute, I'm hoping that we're actually successfully able to have a large pool of developers on the outside who are contributing to YottaDB. And I mean, just as was the case for the Linux kernel and a lot of other open source software, there's a core set of developers that are responsible for what actually goes out as releases, but the number of contributors is much larger than that. Now, I realize that this is and the caveat here is that this is a long-term strategy. The code internally within YottaDB, especially the code of the database engine and the compiler, can be quite complex, and so we want to work with mentoring and tutoring and creating standards and all the other things, but this is a long-term thing that we're hoping to bring about. So, and then we're small, but we don't intend to stay small. We would like to grow, and certainly from what I've said, it should be obvious that you can use YottaDB for any mumps application, but we certainly would like to grow our business beyond mumps applications. So I think that much as I like mumps, I think the world is not beating a path to the door of mumps for creating new applications, and so what we want to do is I think that mumps actually gives us a strategic competitive advantage. So what it allows us to do is really rapidly create new APIs. So mumps is actually a very powerful and flexible programming language. It allows us to create APIs. So let's say if you were to take, there's about 100 or so other NoSQL databases. So let's say if we take XYZ SQL or XYZ NoSQL, we can create an API which is compatible with that very easily. But more importantly, if you're using a database today, you have to adapt your application to the database. And what we are hoping to do is to say, by saying we bring the database to the application, we are saying that if we consider mumps to be our internal tool for developing APIs, we can create an API for your application, and we can create an API that suits your application rather than you having to adapt the application to our API. So that's what I mean by the first statement. We bring the database to the application. You don't need to bring the application to the database. And the second thing, got to get Yotta when Exa and Zeta aren't enough, is just sort of a little tongue-in-cheek slogan. So for those who don't realize that Yotta is actually the largest metric prefix that is defined. So it's 1,000 to the power of 8, and Yotta comes from the old Greek word for 8. And so the prefixes before that, so Yotta is 10 to the power of 24. Zeta is 10 to the power of 21, and Exa is 10 to the power of 18. So there happens to be another database company that has a product called Exadata, which they charge a lot of money, and it's certainly not open source. And so it's 10 to the 18th. They also happen to have a file system called the Zettabyte file system, which is 10 to the 21. So, we say we got to get Yotta when those things are not big enough. And although I don't think, at least in my lifetime, we will see storage big enough to hold YottaDB. We did a back-of-the-envelope calculation that shows that actually, theoretically, we could create a database that went up to, a yottabyte. And also, as a little piece of trivia, the weight of the Earth is somewhere around 5 or 6 yottagrams. So that's kind of what we intend to do to grow the business. And we actually have someone on the outside who is a former GTM developer who retired some years ago, and his son, for his birthday, presented him with a Raspberry Pi. And so one of the things he's doing is porting the code base to a Raspberry Pi. So we're working with him and helping him, and we're hoping to make the Raspberry Pi into a real platform. And again, there are other things, other platforms that we can work on. So, for example, there is the on Windows 10 there's a Linux subsystem, and we can get the code base running on that subsystem and so on. So that's from a technology side. Obviously, from a revenue and a product side, we need to know which of these are actually going to be products which are going to help us succeed and grow the business. But that's sort of the road ahead, and I'm sure there's a lot of hard work that needs to be done there. And then, so you notice all of my slides have a rather monochromatic feel to them. There are no slogans or anything like that. So we still have to do things like, create a logo and business cards and have a real website. I mean, right now the website has content. It just doesn't have the look and feel of that we want. So I actually have a couple of proposals from companies that I'm looking at to create the branding. Talked about porting to Linux and ARM, which is basically what the Raspberry Pi is. And we certainly hope to be putting out more releases with enhancements. And for the most part, anything that we do, we're going to try to create issues out on GitHub and then work to those issues. So the exceptions to that will be some case where, let's say, we have a customer, and what we want to do, let's say the customer happens to report a software defect, then what we'll do is we'll privately have that software defect, but it wouldn't be appropriate to identify that customer. They need to identify themselves if they care to. So in that case, we may have our own private tracking of the defect, but on GitHub we'll say here's the issue, and we'll put it out on GitHub. And in other cases, the customer may actually fund us to do some development, and announcing that development up front may give away their hand, or provide some sort of strategic competitive information that we or they would rather not provide in advance. So with the exception of with those few exceptions, anything that we're going to be working on, we're going to try and create issues on GitHub, and then implement those issues, whether they're enhancements or defects, and we'll put them out in releases. And that's really about all that I had to say from a formal presentation point of view. But please jump in with questions, comments, concerns.
Has Configure been changed over to run with YottaDB?
No, Configure still is exactly the GTM Configure. So all of those changes, I think, will take place over time.
So Configure won't work with YottaDB?
No, Configure will work with YottaDB. Remember, everything is completely compatible.
Right, okay. There's nothing. Okay.
So you unpack the tarball and you run Configure, and that will install YottaDB just as it installed GTM.
Good, okay, thanks.
Sure. And Sam Habiel and Christopher have contributed a YDB install script, which basically will download and install the latest YottaDB. They actually changed the GTM install script. At some point, we need to change that to the YDB install script.
Bhaskar, could you elaborate a little bit on what you meant by that you're going to handle interfaces with other databases, like I assume things like Redis or so?
Well, let's just say that we see a market opportunity, or a customer comes to us and says, I'm using Redis, and I would prefer to use YottaDB if I can. Can you create an API that's compatible with Redis? So in that case, what we'll be able to do with Mumps is rapidly create that API, and then since the code base has the ability to call in from C to M, we'll basically create a C to M call and then have a Redis compatible API.
So most of them are going to be things like TCP/IP connections rather than some kind of.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you clearly. Could you speak up again, Dave?
I was saying most of these would be some kind of TCP/IP connection.
Well, it depends on the database. So there are databases where there's a separate client and a server, and in those cases, we would basically create something, using TCP/IP. But the other part is there are databases that you basically make in-memory calls, and a simple example there is SQLite. Not that that's a competitor, but that's an example of a database that makes in-memory calls. So one of the ways by which, so if you're using one of these other databases today, you have to use a client which makes calls and then goes over a TCP connection. So your application essentially has to adapt to the database. What we might be able to do is, let's say, if you're, XYZ, if you're developing XYZ software and you want a database, one of the things we can do is we can actually create an API for you, which is an in-process call to the database engine, rather than requiring you to go out over a TCP connection.
Okay. Well, and of course, this will all be worked out as clients come up with needs and.
Right. Right. One of the things you get to be, when you're in the open source business, and this certainly is very true in the GTM world as well, is that you don't have the luxury of having licensed revenue funding the things that you want to, that you think you want to do just because they're nice to do. In the open source business, you really have to stay pretty closely focused to the things that actually add value, because ultimately, in the end, we have, rent to pay and salaries to pay and all of those things that, just like anyone else.
Cool. Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions or comments?
The current release 1 that you have is exactly same as the latest GTM version, right?
It was the same as the latest GTM version that at the time. I think it still is the latest GTM version, but obviously every time they. Excuse me, I think I pressed the wrong key here. Every time they put out a version, obviously there'll be a lag before we can retrofit our changes and then run tests and so on. So in general, our goal is to be current with the latest GTM version, but subject to some time lag, which is likely to be in the order of weeks to a small number of months.
But you do have some minor changes with the YottaDB release 1 versus the latest.
We have some enhancements and some fixes, yeah.
Okay.
But we don't have anything that is not backward compatible. So,
okay.
So if you take a GTM release and you take your application, our goal is for that application to run unchanged on YottaDB, which is why, for example, there is the intrinsic special variable $Z version, which includes GTM in its string, and there are applications that check $Z version and check that there's GTM in $Z version. So as part of our enhancements to YottaDB, we did not touch $Z version. We left it exactly as is, and instead we introduced a new intrinsic special variable $ZY release. And if you look at $ZY release, that tells you the YottaDB version.
Is there a specific enhancement that you make currently that someone who develops in Vista could take advantage of that says, okay, definitely I should be using YottaDB because it's better than the GTM?
Well, for example, we've made made a performance enhancement to dollar order. So dollar order will run faster, and especially the reverse dollar order, well, not especially, both the forward and the reverse will run faster. We are currently working on reverse dollar query. So, these are things that that Vista will benefit from. Now, we're not making any functional changes that Vista will really benefit from, because in some sense Vista, at least according to the standards and conventions, the functions or the functionality or the API of the underlying mumps that it can call is very clearly defined. Mm-hmm. So if we were to come up with some new function or some new command, Vista would not be able to use it.
Yeah.
So for the most part, as far as Vista is concerned, the important things that we're doing are performance related.
Okay.
So in light of the fact that you're getting GTM, you're as backwards compatible as you can be to GTM, does this mean the dollar system on your system will claim to be a GTM system rather than your own whatever number you choose?
Yes. So the way that you'll be able to tell that it's YottaDB is by looking at the ISV $ZY release.
Okay.
And there isn't really a MDC anymore that we can go to get a different dollar system.
Yeah, that's true. I assume that when time happens, should it happen, that GTM is different from YottaDB, then that decision may be evaluated again.
Correct.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay. Well, if you don't have any other questions or comments at this time, I guess I'll turn it back over to Peter. And up on the screen, you have my contact information, and please do reach out to me if you care to. And by the way, please do not call my old cell phone number. I had that for over 10 years, and someone else has that number, and I had to turn that over to back to FIS when I left. Okay. And for a variety of reasons, and then looks like Verizon gave it to someone else, and that person, I think, is sick of getting calls for me.
But by the way, I'm just curious, are people who...
I agree.
Okay.
I'm sorry?
Companies who want to use YottaDB assumes that you will be providing support services for YottaDB?
Yes. I mean, that's our business model,
right.
Which is the most common open source business model. So the software is free, the people are not. So if you need support, we'll provide support. If you need training, we'll provide training. So we have someone who is basically, buying a training class that we're going to provide. So those are the two things that we'll be doing, at least for now. And certainly again, a lot of the future stuff really depends on how successful we are. If we're sort of 100th of as successful as Red Hat, we might have certification and things like that, but we're nowhere near that size yet.
All right. Thank you, Bhaskar, for go ahead.
I was just going to say thank you for the opportunity.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I think this has a great future, and we look forward to be using YottaDB. Thank you. Take care.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.